Harlem in the early 1930s did not sleep the way other neighborhoods slept. It breathed. It hummed. It endured. Beneath the glow of street lamps and the haze of cigarette smoke drifting from brownstone windows, something invisible held the community. Together, something stronger than fear and deeper than hunger. It was dignity. And dignity, in those years, was under constant assault. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson understood that better than most. He was not the loudest man in any room. He did not pound tables or throw threats like confetti. His power rested in stillness, in measured words, in eyes that seemed to see beyond the present moment. Men who underestimated him rarely did so twice. Yet those who truly knew him would. Say his strength was not intimidation, it was discipline. The previous months had been tense. Harlem had seen raids dressed up as law enforcement and cruelty disguised as order. Businesses owned by black entrepreneurs were inspected with microscopic scrutiny, while others flourished without interference. The pattern was impossible to ignore. But Bumpy had chosen patience over escalation. He knew that one reckless spark could ignite a fire that would burn the very people he wanted to protect. Still, pressure was building. One cold evening, inside a modest club off Lenox Avenue, the music faltered mid-note. The trumpet trembled into silence. Conversations dimmed. The front doors burst open, and uniformed officers poured in like a rehearsed storm. They claimed violations, permits, licensing, minor infractions that rarely closed other establishments. But this was not about paperwork, it was about humiliation. The owner, Mr. Alston, a quiet man who had invested his life savings into that club, stood trembling as officers overturned tables. Patrons were ordered against walls. Women in evening gowns were searched with careless hands. One officer deliberately knocked over a framed photograph of Alston's late father, a World War I veteran, and let the glass shatter across the floor. Outside, a crowd gathered, and someone whispered Bumpy's name. When he arrived, he did not rush. He walked. His coat was buttoned against the wind, his hat casting a shadow across his calm expression. Beside him walked his bodyguard, a former soldier named Isaiah, whose silence carried a different weight. Isaiah had seen what chaos looked like when control was lost. He had buried friends in foreign soil. He had promised himself he would never hesitate again if violence came knocking. But Bumpy had given him one rule: we respond with mind first, muscle last. Inside the club, the damage was done. Mr. Alston sat on a broken chair, staring at the debris of his dream. Officers were leaving now, satisfied with the message they had sent. One of them brushed past Bumpy at the entrance, offering a thin smile that held no humor. "Cleaning up the neighborhood," the officer said. Bumpy did not react. He stepped inside and surveyed the wreckage slowly. The air smelled of spilled whiskey and insult. He knelt down, carefully, deliberately. He picked up the shattered photograph frame and began gathering the pieces of glass with his bare hands. Isaiah tensed. "Let me do that." But Bumpy shook his head. "This belongs to him," he said softly, nodding toward Mr. Alston. "And what belongs to a man deserves respect." The room watched in silence, that silence heavy. Reverent was more powerful than shouting ever could have been. Outside, word spread quickly. Some wanted retaliation. Some wanted revenge. Anger is easy to summon when dignity is stripped publicly. But Bumpy understood something deeper. Violence would confirm every stereotype being used against them. The injustice was deliberate. It was designed to provoke, and someone, somewhere, was orchestrating it. Within days, reports emerged of similar inspections across Harlem. Clubs shuttered, vendors fined. Community leaders questioned aggressively. Each incident just small enough to avoid headlines, just large enough to suffocate progress. Bumpy began tracing patterns. The permits being challenged had been valid for years. The complaints were anonymous but filed in clusters. And each complaint routed through the same downtown office. An office rumored to have close ties to powerful figures who viewed Harlem as territory to be controlled rather than a community to be respected. One name floated quietly in the background, not shouted. Not confirmed. But present. Bumpy did not chase rumors. He chased proof. He began attending city council meetings, not as spectacle, not as threat, but as observer. He sat quietly in the back row, listening. He memorized faces. He tracked votes. He noticed who avoided eye contact when Harlem was mentioned. Meanwhile, Isaiah grew restless. They think silence means fear. Isaiah said one evening as they walked past shuttered storefronts. No, Bumpy replied calmly. They think silence means we are thinking. Isaiah looked at him carefully. And are we? Bumpy stopped beneath a street lamp, its light catching the edges of his expression. We are preparing. The turning point came unexpectedly. A young delivery boy named Marcus, no older than 16, was detained during one of the so-called inspections. He had been carrying sheet music from one club to another. Officers accused him of loitering. When he protested respectfully, they pushed him to the ground. The community saw it. Marcus's mother saw it. Humiliation again. Public, intentional. This time, outrage boiled dangerously close to eruption. Crowds gathered that night outside the precinct, demanding answers. Isaiah stood at Bumpy's side as tension thickened. He could feel it in the air, the kind of atmosphere where a single gunshot could change everything. Officers stood armed behind barricades. Fingers hovered near triggers. History teetered on a razor's edge. Isaiah's instincts screamed. He positioned himself slightly forward, prepared to shield Bumpy if chaos broke loose. But Bumpy stepped ahead instead. He did not shout at the officers. He did not rally the crowd into frenzy. He raised one hand and waited. It took nearly a full minute for the crowd to quiet. That minute felt eternal. Every eye turned toward him. Every breath seemed suspended. Then he spoke. Go home, he said calmly. The crowd murmured in confusion. Go home tonight, he continued. Let them see we do not break when provoked. Let them see discipline. Tomorrow morning, we return with lawyers, with petitions, with witnesses. We return with truth. Someone shouted, and if they don't listen? Bumpy's gaze did not waver. Then we speak louder with unity, not with fire. There it was, the decisive moment. Not a shot fired, not a fist thrown, but the deliberate choice of restraint. When violence would have been easier, the crowd slowly began dispersing. Officers lowered their weapons slightly. Surprised, Isaiah exhaled. Later that week, Bumpy organized something no one expected. A public forum. Not underground. Not secret. Open. He invited business owners, clergy, veterans, mothers, even city representatives. He framed it not as accusation, but as dialogue. Attendance was uncertain, but the hall filled, one by one. Citizens stood and spoke about unfair targeting, about lost income, about children watching their parents disrespected. They spoke calmly, factually, with dignity, and something shifted. When injustice is exposed in the light, it loses some of its power. City officials who had quietly approved the raids began facing public scrutiny. Questions emerged in newspapers. Patterns were no longer whispers, they were documented. Pressure moved upward. Those orchestrating the intimidation had expected retaliation. They had prepared for riots. They had prepared for violence that would justify harsher crackdowns. They had not prepared for organized composure. Weeks passed. Marcus's charges were quietly dropped. Permits were reinstated. Inspections slowed. Humiliation campaign did not disappear entirely, but it retreated. One evening, Mr. Alston reopened his club. The trumpet played again. The photograph of his father was restored in a new frame, placed prominently near the entrance. Bumpy stood near the back of the room, listening to the music return. Isaiah approached him. They were ready tonight, Isaiah said softly. Ready? For something else? Bumpy nodded. Double quotes, yes. And if they had fired? Isaiah asked carefully. Bumpy looked at him for a long moment. Then history would remember a gunshot, he said quietly. Instead, it will remember restraint. The music swelled. People danced. Not because fear had vanished, but because dignity had survived. And in Harlem, survival with dignity was victory. But Bumpy knew something the celebration did not. This was not the end. Power does not retreat permanently. When challenged. It recalculates. And somewhere downtown, men who preferred control over cooperation were already adjusting their plans. The silence had broken, but the storm had only begun to gather. The music had returned to Harlem, but the tension never truly left. On Lenox Avenue, laughter floated once again through open club doors, and the brass of a trumpet could still make a weary man forget his troubles for a few hours. Yet beneath that rhythm, something more subtle had begun to shift. The inspections had slowed, yes. The charges against young Marcus had been dropped without apology. Permits were quietly reinstated. On the surface, it looked like victory, but Bumpy Johnson did not believe in surface victories. He believed in patterns, and the pattern had changed. The raids had been loud and humiliating. They were meant to provoke chaos. When that failed, when Harlem answered cruelty with composure, the opposition adjusted. Now the pressure was quieter, more surgical. Loans were suddenly denied. Suppliers were warned against doing business with certain addresses. Insurance premiums rose overnight without explanation. It was not destruction, it was suffocation. And suffocation is harder to fight than fire. One evening, as the winter wind pushed newspapers along the sidewalk like restless ghosts, Isaiah noticed something different. The street outside Alston's reopened club was busier than usual, but not with patrons. Two unfamiliar men leaned against a parked sedan, hats low, eyes alert. They were not officers. They did not wear badges. But their posture carried authority. Not police, Isaiah murmured. No, Bumpy replied quietly. Worse. The men watched who entered and who left. They took notes. Names, faces, patterns of attendance. A subtle warning to anyone considering support for Harlem's independent businesses. Fear spreads silently when people feel observed. Inside the club, the mood felt strained despite the music. Mr. Alston approached Bumpy with a folded envelope. In trembling hands, "It came this afternoon," he said. Bumpy opened it carefully. The letter was unsigned. It offered protection. At a price. Not an outrageous price. Not even illegal on paper. Just enough to redirect profit away from Harlem's own progress and into invisible pockets. Downtown, Isaiah's jaw tightened. They want control without fingerprints. Bumpy nodded slowly. They want surrender disguised as partnership. Over. The next week, similar letters appeared across the neighborhood. Some owners, exhausted by uncertainty, considered accepting. Others refused immediately. Division began creeping into conversations. Suspicion among neighbors. The unity that had protected them now faced a more complicated test. The injustice had evolved. It was no longer humiliation in public. It was coercion. In private. One afternoon, Bumpy received an invitation, formal, embossed, impossible to ignore. A private dinner at a midtown hotel. The host was never named directly, but the implication was clear. Powerful investors wished to discuss stabilization efforts. Isaiah read the card and exhaled slowly. Trap. Conversation, Bumpy corrected calmly. Conversation with wolves. Even wolves understand balance, Bumpy said. They hunt when they sense weakness. Isaiah studied him carefully. And do we look weak? Bumpy adjusted his cuffs. We look patient. The hotel dining room shimmered under crystal chandeliers. White tablecloths, polished silverware, soft piano, music drifting in the background. It was a world far removed from the brick-lined sidewalks of Harlem. The men at the table smiled warmly when Bumpy entered. Their suits were tailored, their watches expensive. Their voices smooth. They spoke of order, of opportunity, of shared prosperity. They praised Bumpy's influence and suggested that with proper alignment, Harlem could flourish under structured guidance. It was a refined word for control. They offered investment conditional, loans monitored, expansion supervised. All roads leading through them. Isaiah stood a discreet distance away, observing hands, exits, subtle gestures. He sensed tension beneath the politeness. These were not men accustomed to refusal. When the proposal ended, all eyes turned to Bumpy. He did not respond immediately. He folded his napkin neatly, took a measured sip of water, allowed silence to stretch just long enough to create discomfort. Then he spoke. "Prosperity that requires obedience," he said calmly, "is not prosperity. It is dependency." The temperature at the table seemed to drop. One investor leaned forward. "Without coordination, neighborhoods like yours become unstable." "Harlem is stable," Bumpy replied evenly. "What it resists is ownership." The smiles faded slightly. Another man's voice sharpened. "Refusal would be unfortunate." Isaiah shifted subtly, prepared for escalation. But Bumpy remained still. "Unfortunate for whom?" he asked quietly. No one answered directly. The dinner ended without agreement, and desperation began. Within days, a new tactic emerged. Rumors, whispers that certain Harlem businesses were fronts for illicit activities. Anonymous tips filed to regulatory boards. Banking audits initiated simultaneously across multiple storefronts. It was strategic overload. Isaiah paced one evening inside Bumpy's modest office. "They're trying to bury us in paperwork." "They're trying to exhaust us," Bumpy corrected. "And if exhaustion doesn't work, then they will attempt something louder." Isaiah stopped pacing. "Violence." Bumpy's eyes held steady. "Possibly." The prediction arrived. Sooner than expected. Late one night, flames erupted in the alley behind a small print shop owned by a widowed mother of two. The fire was contained before it spread, but the message was unmistakable. Investigators ruled it electrical. Yet the wiring had been inspected days earlier. Fear surged again. Crowds gathered not in protest, but in worry. Isaiah's instincts screamed. He wanted to double patrols, arm more men, prepare for retaliation. But Bumpy called a meeting instead. Not underground, not secret, public, business owners, clergy, teachers, even skeptical residents filled the community hall. Tension crackled. Like static, Bumpy stood before them. "They believe fear will fracture us," he began calmly. "They believe if they make progress feel dangerous, we will surrender safety for submission." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. "We must choose carefully," he continued. "If we answer desperation with desperation, we justify their narrative. If we fracture, they win without firing a shot." A young man stood abruptly. "So we just endure?" Bumpy met his gaze. "No, we organize." He outlined a plan not of retaliation, but of transparency. Collective legal defense funds. Shared accounting oversight to prevent false accusations. Unified supplier agreements so no single business could be isolated easily. Community patrols, not armed militias, but watch groups trained to document and report rather than confront. It was strategic resilience. The turning point came unexpectedly days later. A major downtown newspaper prepared to publish a piece portraying Harlem's resurgence as unstable and criminally influenced. Anonymous sources fueled the narrative. The timing was perfect, right before key municipal votes affecting funding and zoning. Isaiah obtained word of the article hours before print. "They're about to bury us publicly." Bumpy read the draft copy in silence, every sentence dripped with implication. He did not rage, he did not threaten. Instead, he picked up the telephone. He called the editor directly. The conversation was brief, respectful, measured. He requested only one thing: inclusion. If you wish to write about Harlem, he said calmly, print the full story. Interview the veterans whose permits were denied. Speak to the mothers rebuilding businesses after unjust closures. Publish the facts, or publish the bias. But do not pretend one is the other. There was no shouting, no intimidation, just clarity. Editor hesitated. The article, when released the next morning, looked very different from its original draft. It included testimony from Harlem residents. It documented the suspicious pattern of audits and anonymous letters. It questioned not accused, but questioned the sudden alignment between private investors and regulatory pressure. Light, once again, disrupted shadow. Downtown investors realized something crucial. Harlem was no longer isolated, it was organized, and organized dignity is far more threatening to corruption than chaos ever could be. One evening, Isaiah stood beside Bumpy outside the print shop that had nearly burned. Repairs were nearly complete. The widow's children laughed inside as paint dried on fresh walls. They expected a gunshot. Isaiah said quietly, "Yes," Bumpy replied. "And if it had come?" Bumpy looked down the street, where neighbors carried lumber, where music floated faintly from reopened doors, where fear had been met with structure instead of surrender. "Then history would remember noise," he said softly. "Instead, we'll remember resolve." Isaiah studied him. "You knew they'd escalate. I knew they would test whether our unity was temporary. And?" Bumpy's gaze remained steady. "They now know it is not." But as they turned to walk back toward Lenox Avenue, a black sedan idled slowly at the corner. Windows tinted. Engine humming. Watching. Power had not surrendered. Had recalibrated. And somewhere in the city's marble corridors, men who preferred control were running out of subtle options. When influence fails, when intimidation fails, when humiliation fails, only two paths remain. Negotiation. Or destruction. By the time spring crept back into Harlem, the streets had changed in ways that were invisible to outsiders. The music still played. The storefronts still opened each morning with careful optimism. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of commerce and community, something tighter had formed, a tension wound like piano wire, stretched between dignity and desperation. Downtown, investors had grown impatient. Their audits had failed to crush morale. Their rumors had collapsed under scrutiny. Their threats had met organization instead of chaos. They had underestimated something fundamental about Harlem. When pressure was applied unfairly, unity did not fracture, it fortified. But power, when cornered, does not retreat gracefully. It chooses spectacle. One evening, a prominent councilman publicly sympathetic to Harlem's businesses was scheduled to attend a fundraiser inside Mr. Alston's club. It was meant to be symbolic. A statement that lawful enterprise and civic leadership could coexist without intimidation. Bumpy had not organized the event himself, but his quiet endorsement had made it possible. The club shimmered that night. With cautious hope, candles flickered across tables. Veterans stood beside teachers. Mothers in pressed dresses clutched donation envelopes. For once, optimism outweighed fear. Isaiah noticed the shift before anyone else. The crowd outside was thicker than expected. Not protesters, not patrons, onlookers, and among them, faces he did not recognize. He leaned toward Bumpy. "We've got watchers." "We always do," Bumpy replied evenly. "These aren't curious." Bumpy's gaze moved toward the entrance without turning his head. He had learned long ago that panic began in the eyes. "Let them watch," he said softly. Inside, the councilman spoke about small business protections and municipal fairness. His words were careful, measured, political. But the symbolism was unmistakable. Harlem was not isolated. It had allies. That was unacceptable to those who preferred it. Controlled. The first disruption was subtle, a bottle thrown against the side window. Glass cracked but did not shatter. Conversation paused. The councilman faltered mid-sentence. Then came shouting from outside. Accusations, slurs disguised as concern. A rumor spreading through the crowd that illegal activities were taking place inside. Isaiah's hand moved instinctively toward his coat, not to draw to prepare. Police. Sirens approached too quickly. This had been arranged. Officers pushed through the crowd and into the club without warning. They demanded identification. They separated guests. Cameras flashed from outside, reporters conveniently positioned to capture chaos. The spectacle had begun. Bumpy stood near the center of the room, watching the scene unfold with controlled stillness. He understood the strategy immediately. Create the appearance of disorder. Attach it to Harlem's resurgence. Discredit the unity that had grown too visible. An officer approached him directly. "You're hosting unlawful assembly," the officer declared loudly enough for cameras to catch the accusation. "This is a licensed fundraiser," Bumpy replied. Calmly, not according to complaints received. Anonymous complaints? The officer's jaw tightened. "Step aside." Isaiah stepped slightly forward, placing himself between the officer and Bumpy. The air thickened. The councilman attempted to intervene, but his voice was drowned out by shouting. Outside, agitators amplified the noise. Someone overturned a trash bin to make the scene appear more chaotic than it happened. Gunshot sharp close point blank. Time seemed to fracture. Isaiah spun toward the sound, his instincts igniting like lightning. His mind processed distances, angles, exits. He positioned himself in front of Bumpy instantly, scanning for the source. But the shot had not come from Harlem. It had come from outside. An unknown figure had fired into the air, deliberately close enough to echo through the walls. Loud enough to justify escalation, screams erupted. Officers reached for weapons. Isaiah's pulse thundered. This was the moment. Downtown had been waiting for one wrong reaction. One defensive shot, and Harlem would be branded violent beyond redemption. Isaiah's fingers brushed the grip beneath his coat. He could end the threat. He could fire into the air himself, assert control, show strength. But through the chaos, he heard Bumpy's voice, not loud, not panicked, steady. Isaiah. Just his name, nothing more. The single word cut through the noise like clarity. Isaiah. Froze. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. In that look was everything. Trust, discipline, consequence. If Isaiah fired, even into the ceiling, history would not remember who started it. It would remember Harlem answering violence with violence. It would justify every accusation waiting to be printed at dawn. The true weapon tonight was not a bullet. It was restraint. Isaiah lowered his hand slowly. The officers, confused by the lack of retaliation, hesitated. Bumpy stepped forward, raising both hands, not in surrender, but in command. "Everyone remain exactly where you are," he said, voice firm and resonant. "No one runs. No one reacts." The crowd obeyed. That obedience stunned even the officers. Bumpy turned toward the councilman. "State clearly," he said calmly, "what this gathering is." The councilman swallowed, then spoke loudly. "A licensed fundraiser. Peaceful. Authorized. Reporters." Outside leaned closer. Bumpy then addressed the officers directly. "You have cameras," he said. "You have witnesses. Investigate the source of the shot. You will find it did not come from inside." Silence expanded. The officers exchanged uncertain glances. The agitators outside began dispersing. Sensing the narrative slipping, Isaiah moved carefully toward the entrance, scanning without aggression. He spotted the figure retreating into a black sedan, the same sedan that had idled weeks before. He memorized the license plate. He did not pursue. The spectacle had failed. There was no riot. No retaliatory fire. No confirmation of the story they had prepared. Instead, there was discipline. The next morning, headlines were cautious rather than condemnatory. Shot fired outside Harlem fundraiser, no injuries. Witness accounts contradicted early rumors of disorder. The councilman publicly reaffirmed support for fair treatment. The attempted framing had collapsed under its own design. Downtown. Power brokers realized something unsettling. Harlem had just passed a test designed to destroy it, and it had done so under maximum provocation, Isaiah found. Bumpy later that evening walking alone near the Apollo Theater. "You knew," Isaiah said. "Quietly, I suspected. And if I had fired?" Bumpy stopped beneath the theater lights. They were counting on it. Isaiah exhaled slowly. It was point blank. "Close enough to feel." Bumpy nodded. "That was the intention. Close enough to ignite instinct." Isaiah looked down at his hands. "I almost did, and you didn't. That's because you said my name." Bumpy's expression softened slightly. "I reminded you who you are." The gravity of that statement lingered. The injustice tonight had not been physical harm. It had been manipulation, an attempt to weaponize fear into self-destruction. The true shot fired was not meant to wound bodies. It was meant to wound reputation. And it had failed, but power humiliated is unpredictable. Later that week, word reached Bumpy through quiet channels. Downtown investors were fracturing internally. Some feared exposure. Others demanded harsher tactics. Alliances were weakening. Desperation breeds division, yet Bumpy did not celebrate. He understood escalation rarely ends cleanly. That night, as Isaiah locked the office door, he glanced down. The street. The black sedan was gone. "For now, do you think they're finished?" Isaiah asked. Bumpy's gaze traveled across Harlem, the laughter returning cautiously. The shopkeepers standing a little taller, the children playing without. Flinching at sudden noises. "No," he said softly. "They are calculating." "And us?" Bumpy adjusted his hat. "We are enduring." The sound that changed history had not been the gunshot. It had been the silence that followed. The silence of a community refusing to be baited. The silence of a bodyguard lowering his hand. The silence of discipline overpowering desperation. But silence can only hold so long before a final reckoning arrives. By summer, Harlem had become something few had expected. Not quiet, not defeated, not burning. It had become disciplined. And discipline frightened men who relied on chaos. Downtown investors had exhausted intimidation, spectacle, and manipulation. The gunshot outside Alston's club fired point into the air had been their boldest attempt yet. It was meant to provoke instinct, to trigger retaliation, to give them the justification they needed to tighten their grip permanently. Instead, it exposed them. Now they faced a reality they had not prepared for. Harlem was no longer reacting. It was thinking. And when a community begins thinking strategically, power must either adapt or lose relevance. But desperation does not retire quietly. It seeks fracture. The new tactic did not involve police. It did not involve arson. It did not involve staged violence. It involved whispers, selective whispers. Rumor began circulating that certain business owners had quietly accepted protection agreements months earlier. Anonymous letters resurfaced, suggesting internal betrayal. Quiet meetings were reported between a few Harlem entrepreneurs and downtown financiers. Whether true or exaggerated hardly mattered. Trust began to erode. Isaiah sensed it immediately. Conversations on the sidewalks felt shorter. Handshakes lingered with uncertainty. Eyes questioned motives. "They can't beat us from outside," Isaiah said one evening. "So they're trying to turn us inward." Bumpy stood at his office window, watching dusk settle over Lenox Avenue. "Division is cheaper than enforcement," he replied calmly, "and more effective." "Yes." A prominent shopkeeper named Raymond, one of the earliest voices of unity, was suddenly accused of taking downtown money in exchange for influence. No proof, just implication. His customers dwindled overnight. Friends avoided him. To avoid suspicion, that Raymond came to Bumpy late one night, face pale. "I didn't take anything," he said. "You know that." "I do," Bumpy answered. "But do they?" That question carried weight heavier than any threat. If unity fractured now, everything built over months would unravel without a single bullet fired. Bumpy made a decision. He called for a public assembly, not a protest, not a defense, but a reckoning. The largest hall in Harlem filled beyond capacity. Word spread quickly that the purpose was not celebration, but clarity. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and doubt. Isaiah stood near the back wall, scanning faces. He noticed unfamiliar observers, likely sent to gauge the damage. Downtown would be listening carefully tonight. Bumpy stepped forward. He did not begin with accusations. He began with history. He reminded the room of the raids, the staged spectacle, the gunshot outside the fundraiser, the pattern of escalation. He laid out each event carefully, connecting them not emotionally, but logically. "They tested our temper," he said. "When we did not break, they tested our reputation. When that failed, they tested our unity." Murmurs rippled. "Now they test our trust." He turned toward Raymond. "If any man here has proof of betrayal, bring it forward." Silence. "Not rumor," Bumpy continued calmly. "Not suspicion, proof." The silence deepened. Isaiah watched carefully. This was the moment that would decide everything. Bumpy then did something unexpected. He placed his own ledger books on the table in front of him. "My accounts," he said, "open to inspection. Every dollar, every agreement." A collective breath seemed to leave the room. "If we demand transparency from others," he continued, "we begin with ourselves." Raymond stepped forward next. Slowly, with trembling hands, he placed his books beside Bumpy's. Then another shopkeeper, then another. One by one, business owners brought their records forward. The observers at the back shifted uncomfortably. This was not collapse. It was collective accountability. A tactic meant to divide had triggered unity through exposure. The turning point came when an older woman, named Mrs. Carter, whose grocery store had survived 3 decades of hardship, stood and spoke. "They cannot divide what we refuse to doubt," she said firmly. "We know each other's children. We know each other's struggles. We will not let strangers define our trust." Applause rose, not frantic, but resolute. The fracture had sealed itself. Downtown's final card was about to be played. 2 days later, a federal investigation was announced into financial irregularities in Harlem's small business network. It was broad, sweeping, intimidating. Subpoenas were issued, records requested. It was the largest show of force yet. Isaiah paced restlessly. "They're escalating legally now." "Yes," Bumpy replied. "And if they fabricate something, then we respond with the truth." The investigation was meant to overwhelm, to drown small businesses in legal costs and fear. But Harlem had prepared. The Legal Defense Fund, established months earlier, activated immediately. Lawyers arrived not individually but collectively. The investigators expected scattered resistance. They found organization. They expected silence. They found documentation. Weeks passed. Audits concluded quietly. No major violations, no explosive headlines, no justification for crackdown. The strategy had failed again. And something subtle but powerful occurred. Downtown investors began withdrawing, not publicly, not dramatically, but gradually. Control without leverage is expensive. And Harlem had become too costly to manipulate. One evening, Isaiah stood with Bumpy outside Alston's club once more. The same club that had been raided. The same club where the staged gunshot had echoed. Music drifted into the warm air. Children laughed freely down the block. "They're retreating," Isaiah said quietly. "For now," Bumpy replied. "You never sound satisfied." "Satisfaction makes men careless." Isaiah looked at him. Carefully, you didn't win with force. No, you didn't win with fear. No, you won with patience. Bumpy considered that. No, he said softly, we won with discipline. Isaiah exhaled slowly. The shot. That night, it almost changed everything. Yes, and now? Bumpy watched as Raymond reopened his shop confidently, as Mrs. Carter greeted customers with pride, as Marcus, the once detained delivery boy, carried sheet music down the sidewalk again, this time without fear. Now, Bumpy said quietly, history will remember that we were tested at point-blank range and chose not to pull the trigger. Isaiah nodded. The greatest sound in that chapter of Harlem's story was not the gunshot. It was the silence of restraint. The silence of a bodyguard lowering his hand. The silence of a leader choosing dialogue over destruction. The silence that followed when a community refused to fracture. In the end, there was no dramatic arrest. No public surrender from downtown. Power rarely admits defeat. But Harlem had done something greater than defeat its opposition. It had defined itself. Defined by dignity. Defined by unity. Defined by the understanding that true strength is not measured by how quickly a man can fire, but by how steadily he can stand when provoked. As night settled gently over Lenox Avenue, Isaiah glanced once more down the street. No black sedan, no watchers, just music. Just movement. Just a community that had chosen its future. And in that quiet choice, something far more powerful than force had been proven. When injustice pushes point blank against dignity, restraint can echo louder than any gunshot ever could.